Oji Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the Conviviality of Ivan Illich, Part 3, Essential Thinking for Thinking Life, and this is in honor of a parallax course Michelle and I will be doing starting November 4th, and we're very, very excited about the opportunity. Ivan Illich is an extraordinary thinker, and the first two parts covered some of his thinking. And here, section 6 of the paper starts with some really interesting thoughts that Illich has on contingency and the history of contingency and the idea of contingency, and he makes the argument that the world comes to be considered as something contingent thanks to Christianity, because the world basically comes from nothing, and it could have easily not been created at all. And so there's this radical kind of contingency that comes to define the universe as opposed to givenness and necessity. It starts to be something that could have been chosen and just as easily not chosen. And for Illich, once the idea of contingency is born, it then becomes possible to imagine God's will as contingent, which then means it is possible to understand things without reference to God, because once God's will has become totally arbitrary, it has also become, in a sense, redundant, and the connection between God and the world can easily be cut out. Now, of course, contingency could be birthed in Judaism as well, but Christianity brings with it this interesting doctrine of grace, or God chose to give himself in Christ. So the potential contingency of Judaism that's there starts to really kind of come out with the doctrine of Christ and grace and so on and so forth. And of course, that could be argued. But Illich is kind of trying to point out how in the West you get this idea of contingency. And since for Illich, we only are going to understand the West if we understand it as this inversion of Christianity, the inversion principle being that it's only the best of things, it can be the worst of things, a notion that Bonita Roy spoke about as well, then he's locating part of that inversion with the birth of the concept of contingency. Now again, this is Illich's view. One could argue that Heraclitus has the becoming in flux and so on and so forth. But contingency almost is different for Illich than flux, because to say everything is becoming, everything could be becoming and not have choice and not be contingent. It might have to become. So there is kind of an idea here where you might be able to separate contingency and flux and becoming. Now, contingency would be perhaps a condition of becoming, but it might not necessarily go together. That would have to be thought out. But Illich says that a contingent nature at its noon is gloriously alive, but it is also uniquely vulnerable to being purified and cleaned of its aliveness in the sunset of contingency. So here's the idea that once contingency is birthed, it then also becomes possible to get rid of contingency, and furthermore, it becomes possible to think of contingency as bad. And there is kind of a history of this, where possibility is almost like contingent and nothing, and the name of the game is to align with necessity. And so contingency becomes bad, of which strangely is a thought that is possible thanks to contingency. You need contingency for it to be possible to get rid of contingency. So contingency brings about the possibility of trying to remove it. Well, once you start doing this, and once you associate contingency with bad, where it's better to have control, well, now technology, expertise, pre-planning, the planned life comes into the forefront. Because now, if it's possible to get rid of contingency as made possible by contingency, then it's also then possible to make technologies and systems and plans by which to control it. And so that's where the best of things births the worst of things. Now, Illich goes on to say that, he's also kind of alone in among historians of science in pointing to a world conceived in the spirit of contingency as the origin of the modern conception of tools. But there is something about needing to believe the universe is contingent to believe we can change it with tools. Like, if you didn't believe that the universe was contingent, then what could tools do? So there does seem to be a connection. But what's funny is that humans still seem to have a hunger for givenness, to escape contingency. And so then we create rules and morality around that. And that's where you start getting the ethic around technology and planning, and it's ethical to create plans. Now, again, the course will explore the difference between planning and being prepared, which sounds like redundant, but I think there's a very big difference between planning and being prepared, and we'll have to explain that. But the idea is what ends up happening is gradually there's a plan for how to keep out the contingency and to make life more controllable. But of course, that hurts our ability to have a true encounter with the neighbor, which goes back to the Good Samaritan, who is the one I happen upon Well, that, is complete opposite, basically, of a plan, of pre-planning, of a planned society. And our relation to contingency and the ethics we form around erasing contingency only make this problem worse. Now, moving into the final section of the paper, Illich suggests that the hypothesis was that machines could replace slaves. The evidence shows that, used for this purpose, machines enslave men. Neither a dictatorial proletariat nor a leisure mass can escape the dominion of constantly expanding industrial tools. What Illich is getting at is that there tends to be an idea that, we could have robots do work for us. We could basically have AI and technology be our slaves and it not be immoral because they're not human. And Illich is not so sure. In fact, Illich thinks that's impossible because the more humanity is incapable, the more we rely on tools to do things for us, the less capable we feel, and so we feel powerless. And you could bring in the Hegelian slave-master dialectic here, where the slave has the power, the technology has the power. We seem to be the master because we control the tech, but we actually don't have the capacity. And so Illich is really pointing to that. And you could also bring in the rat utopia experiment, which Samuel Barnes and Owen discussed on Barnes' channel Schizo FM, which was really good. And, that might be a parallel here, which shows that human beings, if they have everything taken care of, are miserable. They just don't function very well. And if that's the case, then again, a world where machines do our labor for us might not be actually a good world at all. Now, this doesn't mean we abandon technology. Individuals need tools to move and to dwell, as Illich puts it, but we need to be very, very conscious of how we use our tools to make sure that they don't become our slaves, because, quote unquote, that's when we're going to lose our power. People feel joy as opposed to mere pleasure to the extent that their activities are creative, while the growth of tools beyond a certain point increases regimentation, dependence, exploitation, and impotence. So we need our tools to be creative, but when tools start to get a life of their own, say because of the zeitgeist makes it immoral not to use them, or they become more advanced than we can calculate, then we're carried past that point. We're carried to a point where tools use us more than we use them. And the name of the game for Illich is how can we be aware of this problem and make sure we don't go through it. The paper will also discuss Carl Hayden Smith's work in Abyssal Arrows, where he makes a distinction between hyperhumanism and transhumanism. Transhumanism here meaning kind of transcending humanity. Smith wants to argue how do we become more human with technology. I think that really does align with Illich. And, on that rat utopian experiment, Illich has this interesting line in Tools for Conviviality, which might suggest what ends up happening if we define the relation of humans to tools in a way that saves us of trouble or something. Well, we might have all our needs taken care of, but we won't have any control over how we are taken care of and how our tools are used, and that might make the world one giant prison. Illich writes, people need not only to obtain things, they need above all the freedom to make things among which they can live, to give shape to them according to their own tastes, and to put them in use in caring for and about others. Prisoners in rich countries often have access to more things and services than members of their families, but they have no say in how things are to be made and cannot decide what to do with them. Their punishment consists in being deprived of what I shall call conviviality. They are degraded to the status of mere consumers. So a prisoner is someone who can only consume. They don't have any say on what they consume or what is made. And the point Illich is making is that technology and the expert class, which, Illich is going to talk about in The Extraordinary, The Right to Useful Unemployment, some of his later works, which are just staggering in the points they make. This paper doesn't get into them, but Belonging Again, the address does. And I think really, really critical work. But the idea is we get to a place where in first world nations, we only consume. And so we're prisoners. We become prisoners. And we have to think beyond that. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. Illich writes, I choose the term conviviality to designate the opposite of industrial productivity. I intended to mean autonomous and creative intercourse among persons and the intercourse of persons with their environment. I believe that in any society, as conviviality is reduced below a certain level, no amount of industrial productivity can effectively satisfy the needs it creates among society's members. Those needs would be things like creativity, friendship, community, and so on and so forth. And as we lose our power, because we think we're masters over the slaves of our machines, and thus they become powerful and we lose it, in losing our power, we can lose our motivation, we can lose our humanity, and so drive to form these communities and to be human. And so we can undergo self-effacement. And so what Illich would encourage us to do is to stay human, to think about work and labor and skills and developing ourselves outside of wage labor or technological efficiency. All of these things are part of what it means to be human. And the fight now is to be human, and how we might do it, because nobody intends not to be human. But why is it so easy then to lose our humanity? Well, because the ways we lose it is subtle, and we have to be paying attention. And a hope of the Parallax course starting in November, an aim of it, is to help us discern those discrete ways in which our humanity is something that one day we realize we've lost. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. For the Parallax course, please visit Parallax. You can find ways to sign up. You can access it through their YouTube channel or through the Parallax website. And thank you so much for your time.